Daniel had been riding for days under the burning sun of the western plains. His horse was tired, his clothes dusty, and his face rough from wind and heat. The trail had been long after the cattle drive ended, and all he wanted now was a roof, a drink of water, and a chance to rest his aching legs. He guided his horse into a small frontier town that seemed to grow out of the earth itself, just a cluster of wooden buildings standing against the endless land. A saloon stood at the center, its swinging doors opening and closing as men walked in and out, their boots clicking on the porch boards. Daniel tied his horse near the trough, giving it a pat before stepping toward the saloon. The sound of laughter, rough voices, and the clink of glasses drifted into the street. The air smelled of whiskey, dust, and tobacco. Inside, oil lamps lit the dim room, throwing shadows across the walls. Daniel moved to the counter and asked for a glass of water first, letting the cool drink wash away the dryness in his throat. Only then did he order a small whiskey to ease his tired body. As he sat at the end of the bar, he listened without meaning to. Cowboys, traders, and drifters filled the room with talk. Some spoke of cattle, others of the weather, and a few of raids and fights that had happened farther south. But two men at a nearby table caught his attention. They were laughing in low voices, bragging about a trade they had made after a skirmish with a group of Apaches. Daniel's eyes narrowed as their words became clearer. They spoke of a young Apache woman who had been captured, taken from her people. She had been passed from one man to another, not for money alone, but in wagers, trades, and careless deals. Now she sat in the back room of a trader's cabin at the edge of town, waiting to be bartered again. One of the men joked about how little she was worth, saying she could be traded for almost anything. The other laughed loudly, slapping the table as if it were the funniest thing he had heard. Daniel's stomach turned. He had seen rough dealings before, men buying and selling cattle, land, even horses. But this was different. A human life was being spoken of as if it meant no more than a sack of grain. He turned his glass slowly in his hands, trying to keep his face calm. His heart, however, felt heavy. He remembered his mother, a kind woman who had raised him on a small farm before she passed. She had always told him that every soul deserved respect, no matter who they were. A man is measured, she used to say, by how he treats those who cannot defend themselves. Her words rose in his mind now, and Daniel knew he could not simply sit and listen. He leaned toward the two men and asked quietly, "Where is this woman you speak of?" They looked at him, surprised. One squinted, sizing him up. The other smirked. "Why? You want her too?" he said, his tone mocking. Daniel shook his head. "No, but no one deserves to be treated that way." The men laughed again. "Then maybe you should go see the trader. He'll deal with anyone as long as he gets something out of it." The conversation shifted back to their drinks, but Daniel's mind did not. He finished his whiskey, set down the glass, and stepped outside. The cool evening air met him, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the nearby cabins. He walked slowly down the dirt road, thinking hard. He had little money left after the drive. His pay had gone mostly to supplies and the grain for his horse. What could he possibly offer? The trader's cabin sat on the far edge of town. A lantern hung outside the door, flickering against the wood. Daniel knocked and waited. A short, stout man opened the door, his face sharp and eyes quick. "What do you want?" the trader asked. Daniel spoke evenly. "I hear you have someone here, a young woman. I want to talk about her." The trader's eyes narrowed, then a smile spread across his face. "You're not the first to ask. But what can you give? She ain't going free." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. They were not much, barely enough to cover a night's stay at the inn. The trader laughed loudly. "That's all. You insult me. She's worth more than a handful of change." Daniel stood still, thinking fast. Then he said, "I've got a sack of wheat on my horse. Good wheat from the north fields, and 2 bottles of whiskey I saved from the drive. It's all I have left." The trader raised his eyebrows. He tapped his chin as if considering, though the glint in his eyes showed he was amused more than serious. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat," he repeated, chuckling. "That's the price you put on her?" Daniel did not answer with a joke. He met the trader's eyes steadily. "It's what I have, and it's more than most would give with a good heart. Do we have a deal?" The trader laughed again, shaking his head. "You're a fool, but a paying fool is still a customer." He stepped aside and waved Daniel in. In the dim back room, Daniel saw her. The young Apache woman sat quietly in the corner, her hands resting in her lap. Her long dark hair fell around her face, and her eyes, though tired, were watchful. She looked at him with guarded silence, not knowing who this stranger was or what he intended. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, but words felt heavy. Instead, he set the sack of wheat by the door and placed the bottles of whiskey on the table. The trader grabbed them quickly, counting his profit with a grin. Then he gestured toward the woman. "She's yours now, take her. I've got what I wanted." Daniel turned toward her, softening his voice. "You don't know me, but you're free to come with me if you wish. I won't harm you. I just couldn't leave you here." For a moment she did not move. Her eyes searched his face, trying to read the truth in his words. Finally, slowly, she stood and walked toward him. He stepped aside, letting her choose her path. When she walked past him and out the door, he followed, tipping his hat briefly without another word to the trader. The night air wrapped around them as they stepped away from the cabin. Daniel led her to his horse, untying it from the rail. She stood close, still silent, watching every move he made. He gently held the reins out to her, showing trust. She touched the horse's neck, her eyes softening for the first time. Daniel mounted and reached a hand down. "Come," he said quietly. After a pause, she accepted, and he pulled her up behind him. As they rode out of town, the saloon lights faded behind them. The laughter and mocking voices of men who treated life as cheap grew distant. Ahead stretched the open land, wide and quiet under the stars. Daniel did not know what the future held or how this decision would change his life. All he knew was that 2 drinks and a sack of wheat had bought more than a bargain. It had given him the chance to do what was right. The horse's hooves beat steadily against the dusty trail as Daniel guided it away from the small town. The night sky stretched wide and clear above them, filled with countless stars that seemed to watch in silence. Behind him, the young Apache woman sat quietly, her hands resting lightly against the back of his coat. She did not speak, and Daniel did not press her. He knew trust could not be built with hurried words. The ride was long, and the silence between them was filled only by the sound of the wind and the steady rhythm of the horse. Daniel thought of what had just happened in the trader's cabin. The man's laugh still echoed in his ears, mocking the trade of 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. To the trader it had been a joke, but to Daniel it was no small thing. He had given nearly all he had left. His wheat was meant for planting it. His homestead and the whiskey was his only comfort after months on the trail. But as he felt the quiet presence of the woman behind him, he did not regret it. After several miles, Daniel slowed his horse and stopped near a grove of cottonwood trees by a stream. He dismounted and reached out his hand to help her down. She looked at him, hesitant, but then placed her hand lightly in his, allowing him to steady her as she stepped to the ground. She moved gracefully, though her steps were cautious, like someone who had lived too long in uncertainty. Daniel led the horse to the water, letting it drink. Then he knelt by the stream and splashed his face with the cold water, feeling the dust wash away. He glanced toward her. She stood a little apart, watching him with guarded eyes. "I'll make a small fire," Daniel said softly. "You must be hungry." He gathered dry wood and soon had a flame flickering. From his saddlebag he pulled out some bread and a strip of dried meat. He offered the bread first, holding it out in open hand so she could see it was safe. She hesitated, then slowly reached for it. Her fingers were thin but strong, her eyes sharp even in her quietness. She ate slowly as if each bite was measured. Daniel did not crowd her. He sat on the other side of the fire, eating his share, giving her the space she needed. He wondered what her name was, but he knew better than to demand it. He waited until she might choose to tell him. Hours passed and the fire glowed warmly. Daniel leaned back against his saddle, gazing at the stars. "My name's Daniel," he said at last, his voice calm. "I live north of here, on a small patch of land. Not much, but it's honest work." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't know what you think of me, but I meant what I said. I won't harm you. You're free to stay or leave when you wish." She did not reply, but he noticed the way her eyes softened slightly, as if she was weighing his words. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned toward the fire. Daniel took that as enough for now. By dawn, they were on the trail again. The rising sun painted the land in shades of gold and red. Daniel felt the warmth on his back as he rode, the woman still silent behind him. He could sense her caution, yet he also felt a change, a small easing of the sharp fear she carried. At midday, they passed through another settlement. Daniel needed to buy grain for his horse, but he worried about the people's eyes. Townsfolk could be quick to judge, especially when they saw something they did not understand. Sure enough, as Daniel tied his horse outside the general store, a pair of men across the street nudged each other and whispered. One woman carrying a basket glanced at Nayeli with narrowed eyes, then turned away quickly. Daniel felt their stares but kept his head high. He spoke calmly to the storekeeper, buying only what he needed. When he stepped out, he saw the two men approaching, curiosity in their eyes. "Where'd you pick her up, cowboy?" one asked with a grin that carried no kindness. Daniel looked at him steadily. "She's with me. That's all you need to know." The man chuckled. "Didn't cost you much, I bet." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "More than you'd give. Now step aside." Something in his calm firmness made the men back off. They muttered as they walked away, but they did not press further. Daniel returned to his horse, helping Nayeli back up before riding out of town. He did not look back, though he knew the whispers would follow. That evening, they reached the edge of his land. It was a modest place, a log cabin with a small barn, a corral for the horse, and fields waiting to be planted. Daniel had built it with his own hands over the years, carving out a life from the wilderness. To others, it was little, but to him, it was everything. He dismounted and helped Nayeli down again. She looked around quietly, her eyes moving from the cabin to the wide fields beyond. She said nothing, but Daniel noticed her shoulders relax slightly. The land was quiet, free from the noise and mockery of townsfolk. "This is home," Daniel said simply. "It isn't much, but it's safe." He led her inside, showing her the small table, the fireplace, and the bed he had built. He motioned toward the bed, then shook his head quickly, realizing how it might seem. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep near the fire." Her eyes flickered with surprise. She studied him for a moment, then gave the faintest nod. She set her small bundle near the wall and sat down, still watchful, but no longer tense as before. That night, Daniel lay on a blanket by the fire, staring at the flames. He thought about what tomorrow might bring. Would she stay? Would she leave? Would her people come for her? Questions circled in his mind, but he pushed them aside. For now, she was safe, and that was enough. Days passed, and a rhythm began to form. Daniel worked in the fields, tending the soil, while Nayeli watched at first from a distance. Gradually, she began to help, bringing water, gathering firewood, even feeding the horse. She moved with skill, her hands sure and practiced. Daniel noticed the quiet strength in her, a strength born not from comfort but from survival. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and bread, Daniel spoke again. "I never asked your name. I don't want to call you what others did." She looked at him for a long time, then finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Nayeli." Daniel repeated it gently. "Nayeli. It's a strong name." She said nothing more, but he saw the faintest hint of a smile touch her lips before it faded again. It was the first time she had let her guard down, even if only a little. The world outside still whispered. When Daniel went to town for supplies, he heard the talk. Men joked about the cowboy who traded wheat and whiskey for a woman. Some pitied him, some laughed. But Daniel did not answer them. He returned to his land, to the quiet cabin where Nayeli's presence was slowly changing the silence into something warmer. The sack of wheat and 2 drinks had seemed a small price to others, but to Daniel, it was no joke. It had been everything he had left, and yet as he watched Nayeli begin to trust him, he knew it was worth far more. The days at Daniel's homestead began to stretch into weeks, and life slowly settled into a rhythm that was both simple and uncertain. Daniel rose early each morning with the sun, his boots crunching against the dirt floor as he stepped outside to tend to the horse and check the fields. He was used to the quiet life of working alone, but now there was another presence on the land. Nayeli was quiet, but she was there, watching, listening, moving with a calm grace that Daniel noticed more and more each day. At first she kept her distance, her eyes always studying him as if trying to measure whether his kindness was true or just another mask like the others she had seen before. She did not smile much and she rarely spoke, but she began to help in small ways. One morning, Daniel came back from the fields to find the cabin swept clean, the firewood neatly stacked by the hearth. Another day, when he came in dusty and tired, he found a pot of beans cooking over the fire. She did not wait for thanks, but Daniel always gave it anyway. "Thank you, Niley," he would say softly, and though she didn't reply, he noticed that her hands no longer shook when she passed him a plate. One evening, while he repaired a harness in the barn, he heard a soft sound behind him. He turned and saw Nayeli standing there holding a brush. She motioned toward the horse, asking without words if she could help. Daniel nodded, and together they brushed the animal's coat until it shone in the lantern light. It was a small moment, but it felt like the first bridge between them. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It became a space where trust slowly grew. Daniel understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned, and he was willing to wait. He spoke sometimes as he worked, telling her small things about his life, a story from his boyhood, a memory of his mother, or a tale from the cattle drives. She listened quietly, her dark eyes steady, taking in every word, though she rarely answered. But once, when he laughed at the memory of falling into a river while trying to catch a runaway calf, he thought he saw the corner of her mouth lift just slightly, as if she were hiding a smile. It was not only in the quiet of the homestead that her presence mattered. One afternoon, Daniel had to ride into town for supplies. He tied the horse outside the store, and Nayeli followed him in, her steps light but careful. Inside, the storekeeper looked up sharply. A few other customers turned to stare. The room fell quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that carries unspoken judgment. Daniel felt the weight of their eyes, but kept his head high. He gathered flour, coffee, and salt while Nayeli stood near the door, her face calm but her body tense. A man by the counter muttered something under his breath about traded women and cowboy fools. Daniel set the sack of flour down harder than he meant to, the thud echoing in the room. He looked at the man and said, "She's with me, and that's all there is to it." The man scoffed but said no more. Daniel paid and walked out, his jaw tight. Outside, Nayeli glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. He met her gaze and softened his tone. "Don't mind them. They don't know you and they don't know me." For the first time, she gave the faintest nod as if she understood. Back at the cabin, their quiet life resumed. But now Daniel could see that Nayeli was beginning to lower her guard. She started to hum softly as she worked. Old songs in a language Daniel didn't know. The melodies were gentle, carrying a rhythm of the earth and sky. Daniel would pause in his work to listen, not wanting to break the spell. Sometimes at night, when the fire was low, she would sit by the window and look at the stars, whispering words too soft for him to hear. He did not ask what they meant. He simply let her have that piece of herself. One morning, Daniel woke to the sound of movement outside. He stepped to the door and saw Nayeli leading the horse from the corral with a rope she had braided from twine. She moved easily with the animal, guiding it as if she had been born to the task. Daniel watched in quiet admiration. He realized then that she was not only helping, she was beginning to make his home her own. Still, the shadows of the world around them could not be ignored. Word of their strange arrangement spread across nearby settlements. Some said Daniel was a fool for trading away his wheat and whiskey. Others claimed he had taken a dangerous risk bringing an Apache woman into his home. A few even whispered that her people might come looking for her, and if they did, Daniel would pay the price. Daniel heard all of it, but he did not let it sway him. His mind was steady. Nayeli was not a bargain to regret. She was a person who deserved more than what fate had given her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Daniel tried again to reach across the silence. "I know it's not easy," he said, stirring the pot of stew. "But I want you to know you're not a burden here. You're welcome." Nayeli looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Why?" The single word carried weight, and Daniel paused before answering. "Because it's the right thing," he said simply. "Because no one should be left with nothing. And because this land can be lonely, two people working together can make it less so." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the fire. But something in her eyes had changed. The suspicion was still there, but behind it was a new light. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the first spark of trust. Over the next days, Nayeli began to speak more, not much, but enough to let Daniel hear the sound of her voice. She told him small pieces of her story, not in detail, but in fragments that hinted at hardship, loss, and endurance. Daniel did not push her for more. He listened quietly, respecting the courage it took for her to share even a little. The bond between them was still fragile, like a young shoot breaking through hard soil. But it was real. It showed itself in the way she handed him tools while he worked, in the way she left a piece of bread for him on the table, in the way she sat a little closer to the fire when he was near. One night, as the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, Daniel lay awake on his blanket by the fire. He turned his head and saw Nayeli asleep on the bed, her face softened in the glow of the dying embers. For the first time since she had come into his life, he realized he was no longer thinking of her as a stranger he had rescued. She had become part of his world, and he could no longer imagine the cabin without her presence. The price of 2 drinks and a sack of wheat seemed like nothing now. What he had truly gained was not something that could be measured in trade or coin. It was trust, slowly forming between 2 souls who had every reason to mistrust the world. The summer sun rose high over Daniel's small homestead, lighting the wide fields and the rough hills beyond. Weeks had passed since Nayeli had first come with him, and though her voice was still soft and her trust guarded, life at the cabin had changed. What once had been an empty place filled only with Daniel's footsteps was now shared by 2 people who worked side by side. Nayeli proved herself to be more than just a quiet presence. She was skilled in ways Daniel had not expected. She had sharp eyes for the land and a sure hand with animals. When a storm rolled in one evening and the horse grew restless in the barn, Daniel hurried out to calm it only to find Nayeli already there, stroking its neck and whispering gently. The horse, uneasy under the crack of thunder, began to settle under her touch. Daniel watched in silence, impressed. As days passed, Nayeli began to tend a small patch of earth by the cabin. With simple tools, she loosened the soil, planting seeds she had found among Daniel's supplies. He asked her what she planned to grow, but she only smiled faintly and returned to her work. Weeks later, green shoots pushed through the dirt, and Daniel realized she had created a garden without needing to explain. But while the land and their bond grew quietly, the outside world was not as kind. In town, the whispers about Daniel's trade had turned into open talk. The story of the cowboy who gave up 2 bottles of whiskey and a sack of wheat for an Apache woman was told at the saloon again and again. Some men laughed at Daniel, calling him a fool. Others shook their heads, saying he had ruined himself by taking in a woman from another world. One afternoon, Daniel rode into town for supplies. As he walked into the saloon for a drink of water, the room quieted. A man at the bar leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Well, if it ain't the wheat trader," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the smoky room. "How's that deal working out for you, cowboy? Sack of wheat gone, whiskey gone, and all you got was trouble." The men around him laughed. Daniel kept his expression steady, though his jaw tightened. He walked to the counter, ordered his drink, and paid without answering the man. Silence fell again, heavier now. Daniel turned, looked straight at the man, and said calmly, "Better to trade for kindness than to waste yourself on bitterness." Then he walked out, leaving the room to their laughter. When he returned to the homestead that evening, Nayeli was sitting by the fire outside the cabin, weaving strands of dried grass into a small mat. She looked up when he dismounted, her eyes sharp, as if she could sense the weight he carried. He smiled faintly, not wanting her to see his anger. "Town hasn't changed," he said. She nodded once, then returned to her weaving, but he noticed her hands worked faster, as though she understood. Life at the homestead was not without challenge. Supplies ran low, and Daniel had to work harder to keep the fields alive under the hot sun. Nayeli worked alongside him, carrying water, gathering wood, and even taking up tools when the soil needed turning. Daniel admired her strength, though he never pushed her beyond what she offered freely. One evening, after a long day, they sat together outside, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. Daniel broke the quiet. "You don't owe me anything, Nayeli," he said softly. "You can go if that's what you want. I won't hold you here." For a long time she said nothing. Then she turned her gaze to the horizon and whispered, "I stay because I choose." Those 6 words settled deep in Daniel's heart. He realized that the bond between them was no longer just his hope. It was becoming her choice as well. Still, the world beyond their land held shadows. A group of ranchers passed by one morning, driving cattle across the plain. They stopped at the sight of Nayeli working in the garden. One man muttered something about trouble with tribes and warned Daniel to watch himself. Daniel stood firm, replying only, "She belongs here as much as I do." The men rode on, shaking their heads, but the words lingered like a storm cloud. Nayeli heard them, though she pretended not to. That night she sat quietly by the fire, her face turned away. Daniel spoke gently. "Don't let their words weigh on you. They don't see who you are, but I do." For the first time she looked directly at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You see more than most," she said softly. In that moment Daniel realized how much had changed. What had begun as a strange bargain in a dusty town was now shaping into something neither of them had expected. Nayeli was no longer just someone he had brought home. She was part of his life, part of his land, part of his days and nights. One late afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains. The sky darkened, the wind picked up, and rain poured down in sheets. Daniel rushed to cover the supplies stacked outside while Nayeli pulled the horse into the barn. Together they worked through the storm, soaked to the bone but steady. When it was over, they sat inside the cabin, dripping wet, laughing softly at their state. It was the first time Daniel heard Nayeli's laughter fully, a warm, gentle sound that filled the cabin more brightly than the fire. He would remember that sound for the rest of his life. Yet not everything was light. Rumors spread that Nayeli's tribe had heard where she was. Some whispered they might come to take her back. Others warned of trouble if they thought Daniel had wronged her. Daniel knew these were only whispers, but even whispers carried weight in a land where fear traveled faster than truth. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Daniel spoke openly. "If your people come, I'll tell them the truth, that I only wanted to give you safety, not chains." Nayeli studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "They will see." Her calmness surprised him, but it also gave him peace. He realized then that she had more strength than he had imagined, not only to endure but to face what might come. The days moved on, each one drawing them closer to a bond that went deeper than words. Daniel began to notice the small changes in his own heart. He no longer thought of the trade as a burden or even a sacrifice. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat seemed like nothing compared to what had grown in his life since that night. When neighbors spoke with suspicion, Daniel no longer cared. When the saloon laughed at him, he no longer listened. What mattered was the quiet garden by the cabin, the sound of Nayeli's laughter in the storm, and the shared work of 2 souls finding strength in each other. The frontier was a harsh place, filled with judgment, hardship, and loneliness. But in that small cabin, something different was being built. Something fragile yet strong, born not of bargain or chance but of choice and trust. And though Daniel could not know it yet, the whispers of her people would soon reach them. What began with 2 drinks and a sack of wheat was far from over. The late summer wind carried a strange stillness across Daniel's land. The fields were turning golden under the heat, and the cabin stood strong against the horizon. Yet Daniel felt something different in the air. He had heard more whispers in town. Men saying that Apache scouts had been seen nearby. Some claimed they were looking for Nayeli, the woman Daniel had taken in. Daniel never hid the truth from her. One evening, as they sat near the fire after supper, he spoke plainly. "There's talk your people may come. If they do, I'll stand with you. I want them to know you've been safe here, not bound." Nayeli listened in silence. She stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night. Finally, she lifted her gaze and said softly, "They will come not for anger, but for knowing. They must see with their own eyes." Her calmness surprised Daniel, but it also gave him peace. She was not afraid, and if she could face what was coming, then so could he. Days later, as the sun set low, figures appeared on the ridge. Daniel saw them first, standing tall against the fading light. Several riders on horseback, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. Nayeli stepped outside beside him. She looked at them without fear. "My people," she whispered. The riders came closer, their horses moving in steady rhythm until they stopped just a few yards from the cabin. Daniel stood still, his hands open at his sides, showing he meant no harm. Nayeli walked forward, her steps slow but certain. One of the riders, an older man with weathered skin and eyes as sharp as an eagle's, dismounted. He spoke to Nayeli in her language, his voice low but commanding. Daniel could not understand the words, but he watched Nayeli's face. At first her eyes glistened with a mix of sorrow and relief. Then she turned slightly, pointing back toward the cabin, toward Daniel. The older man's gaze followed her gesture, landing on Daniel. For a moment the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of horses breathing. Then the man walked toward Daniel, stopping just a few steps away. He studied him with a long, unreadable stare. Daniel spoke calmly, though his heart beat fast. "She has been safe here. I gave what I had to take her from men who saw her as nothing. She is free here. Not mine to keep, just free." Though the man did not answer in English, his eyes softened slightly. He turned back to Nayeli, who spoke again in her own tongue. Daniel could only wait, feeling the weight of the moment. Finally, the older man nodded once. He mounted his horse again, signaling to the others. Before they left, Nayeli stepped forward, placing her hand briefly on Daniel's arm. It was a small gesture, but it spoke more than words. Then she turned back to her people. Daniel's chest tightened. He feared she would leave with them, that the cabin would once again fall silent. But to his surprise, after a few moments of speaking with the riders, Nayeli returned to stand beside him. She did not leave. The riders nodded as if in acceptance and turned their horses toward the horizon, disappearing into the fading light. For a long time, Daniel and Nayeli stood together in silence, watching the dust settle from their departure. Finally, Daniel whispered, "You stayed." Nayeli looked at him with calm eyes. "I chose." From that day forward, their life together carried a new weight, not of fear but of recognition. Her people had seen the truth for themselves. They had seen that Daniel treated her not as a trade or a burden, but as a partner. In their eyes, he had proven something rare: respect. The gossip in town did not stop overnight, but it began to change. At first, people still mocked Daniel for the trade: 2 bottles of whiskey and a sack of wheat for a woman. But as time passed, they saw the way Nayeli worked the land beside him, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. Some began to look at Daniel not as a fool, but as a man who had stood by what was right, even when others laughed. One evening in the saloon, a rancher who had once mocked Daniel raised his glass and said, "That cowboy might have given up wheat, but he gained something the rest of us don't have." The room fell quiet. For the first time, no one laughed. Back on the homestead, Daniel and Nayeli's bond deepened in the quiet ways that matter most. They worked side by side in the fields, harvested crops together, and cared for the animals. When the garden Nayeli planted flourished, Daniel told her with a smile, "You brought life to this place." She simply answered, "We did." As the seasons changed, so did the cabin. Where once it was only wood and stone, now it carried warmth. A woven mat lay near the fire, baskets lined the shelves, and fresh herbs hung from the beams. Daniel realized that the place no longer felt like his home alone. It was their home. At times, when the nights grew long and the stars filled the sky, Nayeli would sit by the window, humming the songs of her people. Daniel would listen quietly, never asking for more, just letting her voice fill the cabin. The music became part of the place, blending with the crackle of the fire and the soft creak of the logs. Looking back, Daniel often thought about the trade in that dusty town. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. That was what the men had laughed at, calling it a foolish bargain. But Daniel knew the truth. What he had gained could never be measured in coin or goods. He had gained trust, respect, and the chance to share his life with someone who had chosen to stay when she could have left. The frontier was not easy. There were still storms, hard winters, and the whispers of people who did not understand. But Daniel no longer felt alone. With Nayeli beside him, the weight of the land was lighter. Together they carried it, step by step, day by day. Years later, when the wheat in Daniel's field grew tall and strong, he often thought of that night in the trader's cabin. He thought of the laughter of men who could not see beyond a bargain, and of the woman who had walked silently into his life. What had begun as a trade had become something else entirely. It was not the whiskey or the wheat that mattered. It was the choice. His choice to see her as human, her choice to stay and build a life with him. That was the true price paid and the true gift received. In the end, the story of Daniel and Nayeli was told not in the laughter of saloons, but in the quiet of their cabin, in the strength of their fields, and in the bond of two people who chose each other in a world that often measured worth in the wrong ways. And so, on that land under the wide sky, two lives, once so different, became one story. A story that began with 2 drinks and a sack of wheat, but grew into something no measure of trade could ever buy.